Riccardo Villa is an assistant researcher here at the department and also a PhD candidate under Professor Billman's direction. Since September 2017, he holds a master degree in architecture from the Politecnico in Milano, and he has published also many books. But his recent interest revolves around architecture and its production under a spectrum of investigation that spans from aesthetics and semiotics to biopolitics, but specifically interest in images, which you will be talking about today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emmanuel, for the nice introduction and also for the nice moderation. And I'm happy to be here and happy to be in this panel also. And happy to be after this lecture about, let's say, what I would call, a certain kind of word images which I would be trying to be speaking about. So, in a piece dated October the 18th of this year, the picture editor of our British newspaper, The Guardian, declared its intention of rethinking the pictures that would illustrate articles concerning what they described as climate journalism, as they were concerned how best to depict the climate emergency. One of the most read British newspapers sought advice from Climate Visuals, a research organization that offers consultancy to this precise scope, as well as a database of suitable pictures. Following the guidelines provided by such organization, the newspaper tossed away pictures of starving polar bears and endangered pandas and replaced them with real people. As we read in the article, these images tell a certain story about the climate crisis, but can seem remote and abstract. This is talking about pandas. And research conducted by the team at Climate Visuals has shown that people respond to human pictures and stories. Furthermore, pictures of people enjoying the sun during an unseasonal heat wave, despite being quite straightforward renderings of the effect of global warming, were recommended to be avoided. They were replaced, for instance, with the portraits of people battling against droughts. In the words of the editor, getting the emotional tone of imagery in line with the issue is critical, rather than the visual overload of society universally having fun in the sun. What is at stake, again in the words of the article, is finding the right focus. Now, despite the apparent consequentiality and reasonability of it, I would like to point out and disentangle what I believe to be a contradictory knot that is underlying in this story. I would like to do so not out of personal interest in journalism, nor in order to step in or to question the argument concerning climate change, but rather to investigate how the presence of images, or perhaps their supposed loss, is paradigmatic of the contemporary condition. In a speech held in 1961, German philosopher Hans Blumenberg described the modern condition as the one of a Weltbildverlust, a loss of word images. A word image is, in his word, that quintessence of reality in which and through which man understands himself, orientates his evaluation and his practical objectives, seizes his possibilities and his necessities, and projects and entwirt himself in his essential needs. Word images assured man a place in relationship to nature and a protection, a screen we could say, against the threat of a continuous confrontation and a loss of sense in it. But with Descartes, Copernicus, Newton, and all the founders of modern science, this, to Blumenberg's view, is put to an end. The word image as a total representation of nature is separated from the finalistic determination of the totality of knowledge of nature. The image of the word is then set apart from its model. By word model, Blumenberg writes, I mean the total representation of empirical reality that depends by the state reached every time by natural sciences and that takes into account the sets of its assertions. The rise of word models is then what determines the loss, or at least the relativization, the putting in perspective of word images that are now degraded as word views or uncovered as ideologies. Philosophy, the first interlocutor and translator of word images by any means, finds itself exiled from the universitas of sciences, and apparently without a role of any relevance. Far from calling back to a reformation of images, Blumenberg assigns then to philosophy the exact opposite task. Philosophy must prevent both the return of word images as much as the stabilization of word models in the pictures they produce. Philosophy turns not just into a critique of ideologies, but almost into a fundamental iconoclastic practice. Scientific knowledge, he maintains, always needs a reserve. It needs to keep the possibility for its verification. When turned into pictures, this reserve is put at risk, becomes latent, and is soon forgotten. Once this happens, methods, frames, dispositives becomes dangerously transparent, immediate. And here we could perhaps outline a constellation of scaffolds that goes from Descartes to Heidegger and Foucault, whose philosophies answer in a way or another to Blumenberg's call. Yet, at the heart of Blumenberg's concerns stands not the issue of knowledge as much as the one of legitimization. The crystallizations of models into images is not just an obstacle to a proper growth of scientific knowledge, a growth towards the exterior as much as towards the interior of science in its methods. The danger of images lies in their potential of legitimization. Word images orientate man evaluation. They constitute the ground for these necessities. They are the refuge of moralists and moral philosophers. Philosophers like Voltaire, Blumenberg says, started to look at word models in order to extract from them metaphysical diagrams, Leitbilder. Philosophy must then stand in the way, radically preventing man to obey to its needs, so the needs extracted by these word images. The Weltbildverlust, the loss of word images, is not something to complain about, but something to affirm and continuously enact in a cultural and theoretical awareness. Blumenberg's speech celebrates the foundation of a faculty of philosophy in Gießen University, an institution that was until then historically devoted to natural sciences. It does so by elevating and de facto legitimizing philosophy to a consular position in which Naturwissenschaften and Geistwissenschaften play both a leading role, one dialectically propelling the other. But this happens only on the basis of a fundamental exclusion, the one of techniques. Despite mentioning the technical constitution of modern science in relation to its methods, Blumenberg successively discards techniques as a mere application of science, as well as a source of problems for it, as he says. According to Blumenberg, techniques is concerned with having at its disposition and taking possession of the things and the forces of the world. Science's essential scope is instead to keep our representation of the world at disposition and under the control of theoretical responsibility. By disconnecting science from techniques, Blumenberg obliterates any political implication that might be linked to scientific knowledge. To him, science and knowledge are first and foremost theoretical practices of understanding and never really active projections. Nevertheless, it is precisely through the refusal of images that science turns from a representation of the physical nature of the world, from natural philosophy, into a project, or into what philosopher Massimo Cacciari describes as a techno-scientific project. As Cacciari remarked, the term project expresses a liberation from any presupposition, the detachment from any word image, we could say. Its logos, its only law, is the abrogation of any ground, an affirmation of nihilistic eradication, or Entortung, as we were hearing before. The orientation here is not given in a coordination with a constellation provided by a word image, but is rather a linear accumulation of partial teleologies, strategically reprogrammed in accordance with the available means of production. Even if not directly engaging with Blumenberg's thought, Cacciari's reflection on the techno-scientific project has the merit of revealing the fundamentally political implication of such an iconoclastic discourse. Project and state, he affirms, are not conceivable separately. The project is always a project of state, in both meanings of the genitive. It affirms at the same time a becoming, but also a stoppage, its suspension. While opening up to it, it demands this becoming to be a state, to be stable, to be in balance. Hence, the fundamental role of statistic, literally science pertaining to states. Through statistic, the blind becoming of the project state becomes accountable in advance in the project's blueprint. But is not this stabilization precisely what Blumenberg was warning not to fall into? Does not the demand for stability of the modern state, first and foremost an economic stability, respond precisely to those concerns of orientation, evaluation, and needs that were proper word images? The project of state, as well as Blumenberg's elaboration of modernity, stand in a stark opposition to political theology and its inherent processes of secularization. Political theology founds its legitimacy over the backdrop of a word image that cannot be ultimately completely grasped, as it is transcendent to any rational form. Secularization translates such ungraspable images from a place out of time into a mundane chronology. The agency charged with such translation is invested by the task of withholding its fulfillment. A complete translation of it, its full understanding, would in fact imply the end of time itself, an end of time that finds its figuration in the figure of the apocalypse as the ultimate or total revelation. It is precisely through this withholding that the apophatic word image becomes graspable. It becomes a picture. The substitution of word images with word models does not really eliminate the first, but rather turns them into mere renderings of the latter. It is interesting to remark that to render literally means to give back. It is a term of exchange that points to the restoration of an initial state of balance. This marks a crucial transformation. If the word images of political theology were ultimately ungraspable and transcendent, the pictures in which word models are rendered are tied to a finite understanding of the word, an understanding without which no balance could be calculated in full evidence. Political theology is here replaced by political economy. The domain of the house, the oikos, and the management of its finite resources is casted upon the one of the state, and then of the globalized world. The case of climate change and the importance of visuals constitutes in this discourse an interesting fulcrum, a potentially revealing moment. On one side, the picture of an ecology in which human life is not sustainable anymore seemed to be linked precisely to the technoscientific project and to its blindness towards any possible finitude, its myth of an endless growth propelled by an equally endless possibility of consumption, so by the forgetfulness over an horizon upon which to evaluate one's actions and needs, a word image again in Blumenberg's terms. This is worth remarking because it is on such hard borders, so to say, that the preservation of a reserve of scientific verification through the refusal of word images, as advocated by Blumenberg, seem to find its material, if not a kind of geological or anthropocenic, point of exhaustion. On the other side, and this is the thesis I would like to put forward, it begins to be evident how the critique of images and the deconstruction of political theology does not imply their disappearance, but rather a lack of awareness towards the fact that the processes of legitimization that they deploy are still at work. What are those visuals portraying the suffering of people due to the incumbency of a planetary catastrophe of the end of the world, if not pictures of an apocalypse? If on one end they are meant to represent, to render what has been calculated through a scientific word model, on the other hand, their effectiveness is measured according to the impact of behaviors and policies. Moral judgments and states of exceptions are now rooted in scientific images. Far from being just renderings, images still show here their legitimizing power, a legitimization that operates precisely on the ontotheological basis of the withholding of an apocalyptic end. What constitutes perhaps a singularity on the contemporary case is the paradox of a word image that gains its power precisely from the very process that attended its abrogation, an image of the end of the world that rises from the very claim of having overcome any transcendent prophecy. My scope here is far from supporting the return of a pre-Copernican age or advocating the legitimacy of conservative thought. There is nevertheless a sense of inevitability and a certain urgency, I would say, in the return of images, in the face of which, rather than choosing between combat and surrender, so between the camel and the lion, to say it with Nietzsche's words, I would like to try to think how at least a certain degree of autonomy, an autonomy of images, and therefore from images, can be sketched. Images have a long-standing tradition in Western thought. For the most part, though, they are looked at with suspicion. From Plato's Idola and St. Paul's enigmatic reflections to the bored spectacle and Baudrillard simulacra, we are faced with the paradox of a philosophy obsessed with the visual, but at the same time never ready to fully embrace it, oscillating from evidence to hypothesis. Yet, whenever images are understood as mere renderings of a model, as mimetic copies of an original or as a functional depictions, their conception is conflated into a duality between a faithful representation of empirical data or, in opposition, as imaginary projections and fantasies belonging to a sphere of thought which is fundamentally unreal. The spectrum that opens up through such a phenomenology evaluates images based on the accuracy with which they would depict a given reality. When falling out of this spectrum, images can only be delirious. But what if, instead of conceiving of images in the binary logic of mimesis and reproduction, as accidental manifestation of a substantial essence, we grant them instead an existence of their own? What if we think of a space, a locus, in which images can live, independently by their need to represent a given, but that is also not just an imaginary one, of unrealistic fantasies, and is endowed instead with a proper materiality? French ironologist Henri Corbin defines such a space as the imaginal. The imaginal is to be distinguished from the imaginary from the same reasons mentioned before. It is not a space of passive imagination, but of active one. At the same time, its images are not subjective fantasies, they are real. They do exist. The imaginal is a word in itself, a mundus imaginalis, a word of matter but with no extension. It is a space of the in-between for which the Quran has a poetic indication, Mahima al-Baharim, the place at the confluence at the two seas. Despite the evident similarities, Corbin's imaginal could not be mistaken as analogous to Plato's topos hyperuranius. Images that live in the imaginal are not ideal. They are not transcendent forms or eidoi as much as some sort of mediating devices. At the core of the conception of this space stands what Corbin calls the imago templi, the image of the temple. The reference to the temple is borrowed from the sacred tradition of a heavenly Jerusalem, a city which is at the same time conceived as a temple in itself. According to the tradition referenced by Corbin, angels and messengers would come from this sacrosanct house in order to inform prophets and theosophers with their visions. And yet, Corbin's move abstract both from the heavenly temple as well as from its mundane projection. And by doing so, it escapes the direct dualism. Firstly, it is not the temple itself he is speaking of, but of its image. Secondly, it is not an image of the temple, but an imago templi. I use the term imago templi, Corbin explains, in order to typify and stabilize a specific intention in a Latin form, ne varietur, thus avoiding the vicissitudes of translation. The imago breaks off from the dualities such as the one of sender and receiver, or original and copy, and institutes a third pole. The case of the imago templi, the meeting place of the two seas, Corbin writes, implies a situation which is above all speculative, in the etymological sense of the word. Two mirrors, specula, facing each other and reflecting one within the other, the image that they hold. The imago templi is thus endowed with a sort of operational or speculative nature, which is not simply directive, it is not straightforward, so to say, but is rather orientational and evaluational. As Corbin himself explains further, the image does not derive from empirical sources. It precedes and dominates such sources, and is thus the criterion by which they are verified and their meaning is put to the test. The imago templi stands at the center of a theological process of encryption, in which one mirror, which is an imago itself, is described as the crypt of the temple. Furthermore, not only the access to the temple, but the very possibility of its image is linked to the possession of its keys. Whenever this transcendent architectonics of communication is kept in function, so to say, the word itself can be understood as such crypt, or as an encryption of the word. The 1974 essay in which the French philosopher introduces this concept, entitled The Imago Templi in Confrontation with Secular Norms, articulates a critique that resonates with what has been discussed before. Corbin outlines, in fact, a situation in which one of the two mirrors he mentioned while describing the Imago Templi has been shattered. This mirror, often referred to as an imago celi, image of the heavens or image of the sky, is, with the due distinction, not so far from Blumenberg's notions of a word image. Yet, in Corban's argument, this image can only be conceived in the speculative architecture of the imago templi and in the optical play of its reflections. Once removed from it, once Western Christian thought, as Corban declares, conflated into a dualistic system of the triadic structure which is at its base, our vision of the world is no longer guided by the architectonics of the imago, and the cosmos is no longer perceived but as anything apart from immanent and purely mechanical laws. In other words, the representation of the world, its model, or the picture that it produces, assumes a normative, directive, and self-legitimizing character. The word directive must be here understood in opposition to orientational, for in such a picture the sense, as a direction of meaning, is taken as a given. For this very reason, no sense-making, no orientation is possible in it. As Corban affirms, when the imago templi is destroyed, one is no longer even aware of being in the depths of a crypt. The word is disoriented. There is no longer an orient. It is important to highlight that despite its undeniable theological, if not theosophical, inspiration and its transcendent character, Corban's notion of the imago does not require religious presupposition to its existence. The temple is such even if no God dwells in it. It would be indeed quite abusive, nevertheless, to understand the imago templi and the imaginal as secular notions. Nevertheless, they prove themselves useful in providing an outline of secularization itself. Even if not belonging to historical time, the imaginal is not an atemporal place. Its time, Corban explains, is the one of a hero history, a discontinuous time, a tempus discretum, the unities of which erupt in historical time and break it up. They create ruptures. It is through these ruptures that history is liberated by a deterministic view and is opened up into what it defines as a parabolic dimension. Secularization can then be looked at through the work of Corban not as the immanent translation of theological concepts that would historically precede a secularized modernity. The seculum, which literally means a cut in time, would instead be the manifestation in time of a latent image, a manifestation that once again must not be understood as a univocal reproduction of it, but as itself an encryption, a crypt that can be endlessly decrypted by accessing to the very architectonics, so the one of the imago templi, that has engendered it. At the end of his essay, Corban himself highlights the connection between temple and contemplation. It is significant that the Latin word templum originally meant a vast space, open on all sides, from which one could survey the whole surrounding landscape as far as the horizon. This is what it means to contemplate, to set one's sights on heaven from the temple that defines the field of vision. End of quote. The imago templi, he affirms, sets us off from the limits of these horizons and put its apparently finite dimension in communication with what is beyond it. Under this light, the eschaton, or the horizon of time, cannot be conceived merely as an apocalyptic end of the world. As Corban himself writes, eschatology cannot simply be an event which one fine day puts an end to the rectilinear perspective of secular history. Rather, what this horizon as an ultimate boundary provides is an image that offers itself to endless descriptions. This, of course, once this image is understood as such in its constitutive autonomy, if not in the light of an ontological difference. So here come to the last part of the talk, which is a bit experimental, I might say, but let's see how it goes. Well, also, the rest of the talk was not, so, yeah. So, Corban conceptualization of images has the merit of providing a model of understanding that is not merely representational in a passive sense. The notion of science that this model outlines is not limited, as Blumenberg would say, to keep our representation of the world at disposition and under the control of theoretical responsibility. Any notion of mimesis, of truth value, or of verification is here suspended, waved and unweaved at the same time. Images are here nor true nor false. Rather, they stand in the in-between line that separates the two, the barzakh, an ideal separation between two adjoining things that never overlap, as Arab philosopher Ibn Arabi had described it, like, for instance, the boundary that separates an area in the shadows from one illuminated in the sun. Rather than foreclosing that reserve for verification which Blumenberg was so concerned about, such images articulate it. The Sophia that is opened up through Corban's imago is rather an architectonic space, one in which science and techniques, a productive or inventive techniques as a techne poietique, not simply an applicational one, cannot be conceived as separate. Such constitutive poiesis cannot be reduced to a problem for science, if not perhaps in the etymological sense of the word, as a pro-ballein, a throwing forward, whose path is always hyperbolic. In other words, as a project. We could perhaps attempt, as a conclusion, to unravel through this understanding of images one of the most recurrent ones of the present time, namely the one of crisis. The Greek term krisis originally meant a separation, a distinction often associated to a political juridical order. Krisis is a judgment in court or an election, so to say the choice of a head either to promote or to punish. Only at the last position, we find that the meaning of crisis is listed as an event, a sudden change in time for better or the worse. Today, crisis is mostly associated with a moment in time and an unforeseen event that marks a chronological boundary, a critical point. Economy and ecology, disciplines that, through their reference to the domain of the household, tend to follow a managerial paradigm, are often associated with such word, for instance, when speaking of economic and ecological crisis. Interestingly, in both cases, crisis represents a point of no return, that is to say, a limit after the crossing of which a balance of what has been accounted, in this case financial or environmental resources, is not possible anymore. In other words, crisis outlines here a closed boundary out of which no rendering, no giving back, no restoration of a debt is possible anymore. Yet, inside this boundary set by crisis and framed by it, the balance is attainable. As we can render this balance, we can picture it. We see here the connection between crisis and word pictures. It is not a case that the one of the first to make use of them, Max Weber, referred to word images as a horizon of redemption, which is nothing less than a religious correspondent to the restoration of debts. The image, delimited by crisis, is a space of possible neutralization. As for balance and redemption can only be attained inside an horizon in which the contrasts of forces can be equalized to zero. Whatever cannot be accounted in this space, whatever cannot be brought to such balance, appears from its perspective as disorder, chaos, evil, an evil from which this very space relieves, liberates, absolves. The connection between annihilation and absolution appears in its full evidence both in Christian theology and the historic translation of Hegel's notion of Aufhebung, of a sublimation that preserves or synthesizes what is being neutralized. Yet, in Corban's account, it is nor a god nor the spirit of history to be sacrificed or sublated, but the temple and its very architecture. In the focus of the imago, in its optical fire, the temple is at the same time being destroyed and reconstructed. The two images of the destruction and of the rebuilding of the temple, Corban notes, are inseparable from one another. Indeed, the reconstruction here alludes to a process of restoration that in this case is not just worldly but cosmic, an apokatastasis of the all, as Leibniz once wrote, and is in this sense not too far from the ambition of universality of both Christianity and Hegel's philosophy. Nevertheless, the architectural image of the temple allows for an hermeneutics of this notion that sets itself off from such a totalizing claim. The neutralization appears here as the algebraic correspondent to an architectonic emptying, to the constitution of a void, the nothingness of which at the same time makes room inside this chaos. It opens up an ordered space. It is at this point that the image of the temple touches the one of the garden. The image of the new temple corresponds to the one of a restored Garden of Eden, in the words of Corbin. The garden is an architecture that acts upon nature without making tabula rasa of it. It rather creates a fence, a boundary out of which all entropy must be pushed. This boundary is, of course, both spatial and temporal. Weeds stand outside of its perimeter, but are as well cut away whenever they appear inside of it, as the garden does not exist without the maintenance carried out by its gardener. Like the Imago Templi, the image of the garden is therefore pre-specific to a spatial or a geometrical understanding of vision, as well as to a historic conception of time. In the last year, the field of architecture and of architecture theory has seen quite a renewed interest in the figure of the garden. In his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, French landscape architect Gilles Clément introduces the garden precisely as a third pole between landscape and environment. Landscape, he says, refers to what is in our range of sight, something that appears as essentially subjective. Landscape is an object that is not reducible to a universal definition. In theory, he continues, for every site there are as many landscape as individuals to interpret it. Environment, on another hand, is the exact opposite of landscape, as much as it attempts to provide an objective reading of what surrounds us. It is also the shareable side of landscape, a scientific reading communicated by instruments of analysis that whoever, whatever his culture might be, can understand and evaluate in a comparable way. Yet, whenever reduced to such mathematical objectivity, the environment turns into a brutal image of a calculated account in which the operative factors deprived of any sensitive expression are translated in credits of depth, in the words of Clément. His articulation of a vision on nature in landscape and environment surprisingly echoes the double speculation of Corbin's two mirrors, an imago celi, the environment, and an imago anime, this landscape, that, whenever not breached on the level of the imaginal, fall into a dualistic logic of an objective and subjective vision of nature. Similarly to Corbin, the environment is objective, is put into distance, only if narrowed down to this scheme. As Clément highlights, environment can also be translated as milieu, a term that suggests an immersive condition rather than a putting into a distance. The garden addresses and absolves such critical ambiguity. The garden, says Clément, escapes cultural distinction. Garden refers to the environment only to establish in it the good rules of gardening, and to landscape only as it never stops engendering it. The garden appears as the only territory of encounter between man and nature where the dream is allowed. Clément still grounds the imaginal potency of the garden into a dimension of dream, thus reducing it to a sort of psychoanalytic unconsciousness that is closer to an imaginary rather than to an image as the one elaborated by Corbin. Nevertheless, the garden here rises as the image of nature as a project, as an image that is not completely alienated from reality of nature and therefore undetermined, just like caprice of fantasy, but rather as the opening up, so the project, of a room of free determination in the context of a predetermined space. The garden not as a space of total unrestricted freedom, but of free will or free judgment, or what perhaps in Roman languages is better known as liberum arbitrium, an arbitration or a balance, the terms of which are not simply given, but constituted. The suspension of determination is evidenced, for instance, by the fact that gardens do not respond to any function. In other words, they are not spaces of production. Yet, the lacking of a specific function does not make of the garden a generic space. As Pier Vittorio Aureli and Maria Sherazad Giudici have recently remarked in their concise history of gardens, these spaces can cater to a large number of people and be very inclusive, generous, open places, but not generic spaces that should fit anyone. We could then perhaps see gardens as emplacement of a potential specificity, as a locus in which species come into being. By species, we refer today mostly to different groups of living organisms, yet we should not forget that species come from spicere, to see, and was often used to mean precisely images, as images were special beings. The ambiguity of this notion and of the garden as an image perfectly embodies the material character of images and of potential specificity that we were talking about. The suspension of direction operated by the imago templi takes in the garden a material architectural translation. Not only is a space without a function, but sometimes is a truly dysfunctional and misleading place. The labyrinth, a recurrent architectural topos of the garden, is perhaps the most evident translation of this character. Yet, precisely like in the imago templi, by suspending direction, the garden materializes an orientation. The orient at which the garden disposes itself is once again not the geometrical point of reference, but rather the very circle of continuous rebirth of the sun that the term orient evokes, the transcendent locus in which the sun is continuously born. This astral time between the rise and the setting of the star recalls, in a way, the continuous destruction and reconstruction of the temple. In the case of the garden, though, this imago materially translates through photosynthesis into the life of species. Through ecology, Gilles Clément states, we have today the opportunity of conceiving of a planetary garden. Through the notion of garden that he formulates, we can think about the world beyond the managerial paradigm of economy and do it so precisely through the elaboration of a word image, or in his terms of a planetary gardening. But perhaps we should start to conceive of this gardening not strictly in relationship with the one star of the sun, precisely like we tried with Corban, to disconnect the imago templi from any monotheistic imposition. The light of the sun is a pure light, something close to what the Romans called lux. Its combustion, so to say, does not consume. It apparently produces no entropy. It carries no evil. The image that this light engenders is always ideal, its garden Edenic. Instead of instruments with which to build an architectonic of communication, image and garden rather become here compasses of an absolute system of reference, of a Copernican solar system, perhaps. Indeed, as we said, the image of the new temple preludes at the one of the garden. But the garden must not forget the one of the temple and of its edification. From Latin ides facere, making a fire, edification reveals architecture as an act of energetic withholding, the collection of stones around not a lux, but a lumen, an artificial light. Through this double articulation, images can be thought as an autonomous form of techniques, maybe even as the mother of all techniques, a kind of techne econike. In conclusion, we can perhaps conceive of images and of their multiple symmetries between garden and temple, soul and heaven, as peculiar kinds of crystals through which an imaginal domain can then be inspected, a space that can constitute a common architecture between science and techniques, truth and artifice, man and nature, without necessarily demanding for the exclusion of one or of the other. We could instead think of images as making room for these contradictions to communicate with each other and eventually prosper. A prosperity or a proliferation that grows in a space that is not the infinite one of the techno-scientific project, nor the critical one of economical resources. An imaginal space that is intellectual and nevertheless real. A locus that, since it is material but has no extension, can never ultimately be exhausted. Such is, in other words, the place at the confluence of the two seas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Riccardo. What a beautiful talk. Questions, comments, please. Who wants to start?
Thank you. It really is just to make a connection, perhaps, that I always felt you were about to make as you were going along, and it's with the cinema books by Deleuze. So much of what you say or what you're interested in what's at stake in the image. And in images as something other than representational, let's say. It's an anti-representational idea of what images could be. And so much, really, even of the specific terminology that you're using, such as images as crystals, I always felt you were about to talk about the two cinema books by Deleuze, and by extension about images as you find them discussed in Bergson. And I wonder if you're aware of that work, and if not, I cannot recommend too highly that you would read these things. These seem would be so useful if you don't already know them.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestion. I'm not, I was not aware of this, but I have to say it doesn't completely surprise me, because I think there is a connection with cinema that I would find in the work of, for example, Walter Benjamin, in which the image is precisely tried to be articulated in this way. So, yeah, in this kind of dialectical immobility, and yeah.
Yes, indeed, and you would find that extended in Deleuze's discussion in the first cinema book.
Yeah. Okay. I will look it up. Thanks.
Thank you. More questions?
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a comment to make, because I got distracted from the very first opening salvo of your presentation. See if I remembered well. You began by speaking about climate change with the image of a panda, and then suggested that was replaced with a human, and the motivation was in order to attract the interest of the various people in the way that an advertiser wants to get your attention. So I immediately thought about the ontological difference between the image of the animal and then the image of the human. I realized immediately it was not of a rodent, who also is deeply affected by climate change, because those animals don't enjoy the emotional appreciation like a baby seal would. And it makes us, instead of being rational and reasonable, it makes us being, in the world of animal rights, very thoughtless. But I'd like just to press you for a moment about that, because I wondered how you might see that fit in to your discussion about the ontological differences of images. The supposition then behind this, the opening salvo, and I know it wasn't where you were going, it was your springboard, was the idea that human life is fundamentally more important than the animal life, although of course it was the advertising, how to get people interested in climate change. But the problem of this disparity is what animal rights philosophers call speciesism, which is the blanket denigration of other species other than ourselves, in the way that racism has exactly the same structural feature of taking one group and ontologically diminishing the other. I wondered how this ontological difference fits in or doesn't fit in with the context of what you presented today.
I'm not sure if this would be the right answer, but I think there's so it's interesting that you were saying that some animals are somehow more eligible to be effective in images than others, and regarding to their look, let's say, because I think there is there's this in this essay on the technical reproducibility of art. Walter Benjamin talks about the idea of technical reproducibility of a picture, and there's only one exception that somehow is encountered in his essay, which is the one of the portrait. So in the context of the loss of the aura, he says the technical reproducibility somehow lets us get away with this aura, but he says somehow this doesn't really work with portraits, with faces. people. And I would not point, I'm not sure if I would point this to some kind of moral value of importance of human life, but I think it connects to the idea of an ontological difference. We could see it perhaps, I'm not sure, but from this Lacanian idea of objet regard, so some kind of third space that materializes in between two lookers. And this would be something similar to this ontologically space of ontological difference, but not yet there, I would say. But I would say then perhaps there is something with faces that is indexical of this space. I'm not sure if I replied to your question. I'm not sure if it was clear, but yeah, I think there's a point there. Yeah, and yeah, let's say the introduction with this was just to make a case for my talk, but yeah, it's of course related. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe to pick up on this, because I think it's a very important point. This ontological power of images is in a way precisely what you try to neither deconstruct nor say that we can construct it, you know, with the discussion of the world images versus the world model. And to point the attention to something so mediagenic, like The Guardian declaring their strategies of how to make their message, which is implicit, most productive, through the manipulation of images, points to this factual, ontological, and also, of course, highly problematical implied a force of legitimization that you are precisely concerned with.
Yeah.
And what I now I forgot what I wanted to ask. It was with regard to the garden in the end, and this notion. So you didn't speak about the enclosure.
Mm-hmm. Very little.
Yeah. Maybe just this. How would you relate the figure of the enclosure? Because they are like inverse. So you have this moment of the confluence of the two sea,
Mm-hmm.
which is not really a substance, and it's also not a source.
Mm-hmm.
It's a model of a speculative space. But then, how does the notion with Gilles Clément of a speculative garden, that means of an enclosure of the globe, of the planet, in speculative terms? How do you think these two can relate?
Yeah, this I'm still a bit struggling with it. That's why I tried to propose in the last part this idea of a garden without a sun, or with not linked to one sun, because the problem with I was fascinated by his articulation of gardens, but I always thought that behind that there's always precisely the problem of making an enclosure of the word, which is precisely what I'm trying not to say, but not to say that this is kind of a infinite space of progress, but to try to articulate the two. And so what I was trying to think is perhaps if we have to think of a garden, since what is the orientation of the garden, and I think if we read Corban, we could think of the orients of the place where the sun is born, but it's not really a place. But then we should be able to also dislocate the garden, perhaps, and make an Entortung of the garden too. Yeah, and so to make garden techniques. Yeah, I don't know, something like this.
Thank you. It was very beautiful. I like this idea of images that live, and I like this idea of the garden as well. So can we think, for instance, of images that live and die in the garden? Yeah? So it's kind of, they die, they are kind of encrypted in the garden, then we, in a way, kind of decrypt them, but the way how we decrypt them, it can be, of course, in many different ways. Yeah? So they kind of get alive. We work with them on the level of information.
Yeah.
But then when the garden, so here I would like to pick on the previous, when the garden gets planetary, yeah? So who then becomes the gardener? And then how, I mean, I like how you put it, you have the landscape and the environment and the garden and so on, but how do we think, for instance, of the landscape and the environment? Does the garden encompasses them, or it's a kind of, what's the relationship between them and, for instance, with the gardener? And yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so actually, you're somehow expressing the same kind of preoccupation that I had with the idea of planetary gardens, in the sense that, as I was saying, I quite liked the way in which Corban articulates through these three poles. So not Corban, sorry, Clément. So the idea of a garden, which is a kind of in between the environment and the landscape. So as affirming this kind of third space between a subjective and an objective point of view. And still an idea of the environment as both an objective, so something which is in distance, but also something that surrounds us. Sorry. But the risk with the planetary garden, I think it's good to think of a planetary garden, but not as a planet, not thinking of the planet as a garden. Because then, yeah, the risk of this enclosure is then the risk of coming back to the idea of word images as Blumenberg was scared about. And this is somehow the part I'm still not decided with Clément, because he says that then we need gardeners, so the planet needs gardeners, but then who are these gardeners, and so are they somehow legitimized by the fact that they want to do good? So it's a bit complicated. So I think it's really important to keep in mind this translation of I mean, not this translation, but this third element of the garden as a third element. So it's always never something which is never correspondent nor to environment nor to landscape. It's always something that has precisely an ontological difference. So a life on its own, as we're reminded.
Thanks very much for your talk. I just wanted to ask if you can maybe elaborate a little bit about why it is important for you to use the term ontological difference of images, because you've done a really beautiful job of getting us to think about the imaginary images, imagos, in these different registers, but I was just thinking that if the ontological difference is basically a difference between beings and being, what is the difference between images and the image for you? Not that that's exactly how you're using it. I mean, I guess that's what I'm just asking for some clarification, because being would be precisely the thing that we can't have an image of. That as soon as you have an image, you've lost it. So, I don't know, I guess just if you could say something about this, the use of ontological difference as being maybe slightly more precise.
I think I would probably not be more precise, and that's probably my point of using it. But it was a bit also a kind of provocation also for myself, in the sense that to kind of reevaluate this term of ontological difference. And I was fascinated precisely by this. So by seeing image not as beings, so image is not as beings, but an image as a being. So in that sense, so as something which is at the same time ungraspable, if you like, so that you cannot make an image that you cannot make a picture of, if you like, so in this kind of contradiction.
Is there one last question or comment? Otherwise, thank you very much, Riccardo.